After all, why shouldn't I play it? Well, precious.
I think you've had that gem quite long enough.
You want the gem for yourself.
Zizaran! A grave digger.
Hi, Zizaran here with a build guide for the upcoming Necropolis League, and this is Explosive Arrow. I am actually once again considering league starting Explosive Arrow because it looks so good this league. First, let's talk about the pros and cons compared to last league. We are losing a little bit of quality of life in the form of white sockets from Borichi. It means that you absolutely at all levels want to avoid a thicket bow. A grow bow even is going to be quite hard to color, but a short bow, quite easy. They will be quite expensive this league, so this is a actual downside to the build. As for upsides, a big problem in the past on Explosive Arrow has been the regen and sort of the staying power in boss fights. However, because of the new automated Warcry support, you can automate Enduring Cry very easily. So you're getting that nice burst of regen every now and again, which is a huge downside for Explosive Arrow. And we're getting those endurance charges for some additional physical mitigation on top of all the heavy physical mitigation we already have, making this an incredibly tanky build, even more than before. What makes this build look so exciting this league is the new tier 17 maps, and the thing that's incredibly strong for that is the taunt feature of Explosive Arrow. If this build guide helps you have a great league start, please consider subscribing. It helps me and my team out a lot. So first, I will cover a little bit of how this build actually plays. In maps, you're basically just throwing down the totem and running. I use Blink Arrow and Flame Dash so that I can blink, then Flame Dash. They don't share cooldown, so they're both instant kind of and feel just really good for quick mobility. Now, a lot of people will drop down to just Flame Dash, and that is completely okay as well. On larger targets, like against bosses or against rares, you will also throw down the Arcanist brand. That will do the Flaming Surge, which will add a lot of damage to the build, and you'll also use Flammability. So there's not that many buttons to push in this build. For mapping, it is mostly a one button build. And then for bossing, you have a few more things you want to do, such as, for example, keep up frenzy charges. And very often we attach Cull to this as well. As long as you're attacking once every like 8 seconds or 10 seconds, you will keep that up. And it feels really good for bossing. Like on a lot of things, we have the taunt that works. This feels amazing on the Cortex boss, for instance. It's been one of my favorite league starters, and I'm forcibly trying to make myself not play it some patches just to have different content for my stream. But it's been my favorite league starter for a lot of builds because it comes online very quickly. It gets a lot of tank from just itself, like an internal factor from champion. It's just a wonderful build. It's very, very solid. It's got okay clear speed, great damage, extreme tank, and it's just very comfy. I love this build. It's definitely one of my favorite recommendations. It's definitely not for everybody because first you have to put down the totem. The totem has to attack, and then the explosion has to go off, and then the ignite proliferates. So it probably sounds worse than it is, but it does not have that nice, you know, like tornado shot playstyle where you right click and the damage is instant. Keep that in mind when you're choosing what build to go for, and there's a lot of different builds we'll have on YouTube this league. We're going to be leveling with Splitting Steel, and we can swap to Explosive Arrow on level 28. If you find something like a Quill Rain or a Silver Branch early on, this is explosive. But even with just a short bow with attack speed, and that is the name of the game, attack speed, you'll absolutely be fine here. Now, an important thing for this build, especially early, we're not going to have Rain of Splinters, we're not going to have a Dying Sun or anything for multiple projectiles. So what a lot of people do is use lesser multiple projectile. You don't need greater. But lesser multiple projectile for mapping early on. I usually don't. I usually only have the prolif, but you can do that and then swap that out for faster attack. I usually do this during the campaign, but in maps, I'm usually just a full ignite build, and I do try to get either early Dying Sun or early Rain of Splinters. However, this is only for increased clear speed. It will not increase your single target at all. So if this is something that costs a lot of divines, like over 2 or 3, I probably wouldn't invest into it. It's fine to throw some Val Orbs on any rarity Crimson Jewel. You don't want to Val unique ones, obviously. But this is just a quality of life thing. Sometimes other builds like Ice Bear, etc. will need these for, or Artillery Ballista will need these for actual damage, and the price will skyrocket. And we maybe not made it as clear in the past that it is just a clear speed thing. It decreases your damage per single target. So Not something you want to spend a lot of money on. I have an exciting announcement that we are going to start having written guides on Maxroll. Some of you in the past might have seen that I did an experiment where I hired Enki to make a written guide for the Path of Exile forums. Obviously, that ends up being quite expensive, and I don't have a way to monetize that. However, now through Maxroll, they are able to monetize through ads and stuff like that. So for those that want a even more detailed walkthrough and they want a written version of the guide, we will have that available for some of our builds now on Maxroll. What makes a big difference here is we're able to put so much more detail about what things look like before you start. Resistance is like a lot more than just the note section of the POB, a lot more leveling info and build info. So we'll have a link to that in the description. Make sure you check it out. Let us know how we're doing. This is something we are looking to improve. This is our very first guide. So Sai will be shadow writing that with me. We are absolutely looking to improve that. So anything you feel is not up to par, anything you feel can be made improved or clear, make sure to drop that feedback in the comments here, and we will work on getting that as good as humanly possible. And hopefully you've already been having a lot of success with our other build guides. For those of you that are a little bit more advanced and don't need all that extreme hand-holding, we will walk through the guide as normal. So we have made a POB, and as you can see, we have the normal skill trees step by step. If you don't have Path of Building already, we have a separate video explaining how Path of Building works. So make sure you click that, figure it out. It is a very important tool for the game. Very important thing for this build is that your Ascendancy does nothing until you have your Cruel Lab, but you will obviously get the huge Fortify buff and all the things that come with it once you get Cruel Lab. So Cruel, very big. The normal lab you don't need to do really. And there's no Transfigured Gem that we really care about for this build. We have a few different endgame trees as well. And especially if this is something I play later in the league, we will make an even more advanced guide, because I usually, when playing this, end up putting like 50 to 200 divines into the build and doing like removing life tap with Elrond rings and going like more advanced. And we do already have previous more advanced guides for that, but that won't be fully up to date with this league's tattoos and things like that. We do have notes as well here, but obviously we go into even more detail on the different forms of progression on the Maxroll site. Here we have splitting steel for leveling and the different item sets. And here is a new tab. This is something we started with recently, but this is a list of all the possible leveling uniques that could be good for each slot. So maybe you find one of these early while leveling, or you're able to pick some up for cheap if this is your second or third character. You probably don't want all of them. You technically could, but I mean, I personally like having a few rares for life. And here we have the early game. So this is when you're getting into maps. And you'll notice here that we have no uniques. This is part of the skill tree. That's why that shows up here. You're obviously not meant to have that expensive jewel early on. But more importantly here, you can see that this is all rares. You don't want any uniques early. And that is what makes this such a good league starter. There's nothing that is going to go high up in price of the early stuff. Everything, it's a very solo self-unviable build. Most of you have probably seen me play this a lot and kill Ubers on this build. Now, obviously, the Uber budget is not a solo self-un thing, but that is what makes this build, in my opinion, such a good league starter. Normally, league starters have a very low ceiling, but a very low floor, but Explosive Arrow actually has quite a high ceiling, where it's easy to get into and keep pouring divines into this build and make it a really big powerhouse. The only thing that's like really nice, but this does very often go up in value, but our Unnatural Instinct here gives you all these small nodes, and it does make decks more of an issue, so Thicket Bow is even more out of the question. We really never want to use the Thicket Bow, and you do want to make sure short bows are on your filter. A big issue with this is it's not on a lot of filters, and it is exceptionally rare because of the way Path of Exile culling system works, where low-level items will no longer appear on high-level filters. Short bow, very good for our build because we aren't using the physical damage, we just want the attack speed, and we want the low short bow so that it's easier to color, saving us crumbs. Now, there is an omen coming back this league called Omen of Blanching. However, it does recolor the item. It is not like Varici where you get 4 off color and then use the Blanching. It will recolor it each time, making it a lot worse. Now, the most important thing for this build, usually not used by a lot of other builds, so the price usually does stabilize and not go insane, but Diadem Dawn is literally 42% more damage for this build once you have the quality on it, and you can use either attack or elemental quality on this. Another good alternative for this build is Ashes of the Stars. With an Ashes, the build can go up to 25 fuses, But as some of you might be thinking, this is very rough on attack speed. You will literally need a perfect bow with the quality on it, and you might even need attack speed on gloves, etc. So here we have the attack and cast speed while focused. That is basically, once you have this crafted, that'll appear on your skill bar as a skill. It's like a orange symbol. Once you're able to reach 25 stacks and have that much attack speed, then Ashes is really good. If you can't, even if you're at 17, 18, don't use an Ashes and try to get attack speed somewhere else. Each extra thing is very important. And real quick, I will walk you through the manual calculation because I do feel like sometimes the maximum sustainable fuses isn't exactly correct. So first, let's walk through how we actually calculate this. So let's open up the calculator and you can see here the skill duration. This is how long explosive arrow has before it goes off. So we start with a 1.287 seconds. We are multiplying by 6 because we have 6 totems at our end game. This includes the amulet anoint, etc. And then we multiply by our attack speed, which is 3.26. And then after this, we're going to add +1. So with this setup, we have 26. Maybe some people will be wondering, why are we only adding +1 and not 6 free totems or 6 free arrows because we have 6 totems? It's very shitty, in my opinion, to add 6 free totems. Sometimes one of your totems is going to be down. Sometimes the boss is going to be moving, but you're at least always going to get 1 free arrow before the skill duration starts timing and the explosion goes off. So this makes sure that it'll always feel good. It is a lot easier to calculate it this way. But what if, let's say that we had 1.287 multiplied by 6, but let's say that we had an attack rate of 2.3. This only puts us at 18, not putting us near our new thing. However, what you can do in this case is the mastery here. This one, 15% increased duration of ailments. That will actually give that up to 1.4. This will be a lot worse for mapping. It'll be a longer delay, like 0.2 seconds more, which isn't too bad, but you will notice it. 0.2 seconds more before each explosion goes off. However, it will give you that extra time for the full stacks to accumulate, and this will give you enough again to hit your maximum. One thing I really want to show people is what if we add this to the build? Look, currently I have total damage per ignite 21 million. However, if I do 50% increased duration of elements, I get 10 million more damage. However, this is not our damage per second. So what this number is basically if I ignited the target one time and left it alone for forever, how much damage would this one ignite explosion do? So this is why the number that we're actually looking at, which you can see is unaffected by this, is that number. The one that's a roughly 7.3 million right now, because that is the number of how much damage per second are you doing. And you do always want to make sure that your ignite doesn't run out before a new one can be applied. So a very important thing for this build is you want to make sure that the ignite duration is longer than the skill effect duration. So right now our ignite duration lasts for 4 seconds. So that means that we could actually benefit a lot more from more things like ignite to inflict with attacks, deal damage faster. However, if it was less, then you would actually benefit from duration. But since we have so much extra time, things like Died in Dawn is just literally free damage for us because all we care about is damage per second. We are about to run through a lot of easy things for this build that you could mess up and lots of tips and tricks, but do make sure that you check the notes section of the build. We do have a lot of things here and super in-depth stuff on the Maxroll guide. It's obviously a lot easier to put things on a website, but here are some of the most easy things to mess up. Now, a very important thing for Explosive Arrow, a lot of people will ask, why do we have minions have 28% increased attack speed on the bow? And that is because of this right here, Spiritual Command. And the line at the end there is increases and reductions to minion attack speed also affect you. This means anywhere that you see minion attack speed, so you get 8% here, another 8% from these small nodes, and the 28% here, all go into your attack rate. So if you see that I take this off, we are losing a large chunk, basically 14% of our attack speed is from there. I have had some builds in the past where I've been able to remove this, but it has been quite a lot of work and a heavy budget. A very scary thing for this build is damage over time. This is less scary this patch than previous patches. Getting things like less damage taken over time or our Kali Pantheon can very often be really good, but You will need freeze immunity for somewhere else. Early on, you will have Soul of the Brain King for your freeze immunity and Soul of Garakan. I have in the past been able to play around a little bit and fit a Purity of Elements for full ailment immunity there, but these two will take care of everything except ignites. And then you try to get as much less damage over time taken. You have the Enduring Cry on autocast this patch, which is really cool. But honestly, I do early on end up having to log out from ignites. They can be very scary, but thankfully they are not something that kill you quickly over time. Unnatural Instinct, very good for the build. You can see all the nodes that it's giving us. So we get all the small nodes here and all the small nodes here, as well as some intelligence, which the build is a little bit tight on. You don't really need extra damage while mapping. You get quite a lot of damage anyway. This is a honestly very high damage build. What's so nice about it is that it has so high uptime because while you're running around and dodging and putting down more totems, they're continuously attacking. So some builds, like for example, Bone Shatter or Toxic Rain, they only have damage while they're actively attacking. So sometimes a 10 million damage build can feel like a 3 to 5 million damage. I always feel like Explosive Arrow feels like more damage than the paper dolls actually show. But for mapping, what I like to do, and this is where you really want to get a Omen of Blanching on your helmet to get a white socket here, because you want to swap between Grace and Malevolence. Now, a good thing here is that Malevolence will make it slightly worse for mapping. However, most of the bosses don't have any auto attacks, so it's very easy to do this swap. So you can absolutely just play with Malevolence all the time, but you will get hit by a lot more auto attacks. You can see here that we have Skitterbots as well. A cool thing with Skitterbots is that if you are using Skitterbots, you can actually use Hypothermia in a pinch instead of another gem. Also, we do have a large amount of Awakened gems that we can use, like Awakened Burning, for example, instead of Ignite Proliferation. On your gloves here, you can get the Exarch Implicit, ignites you inflict spread to other enemies within 12, and that lets you drop that Ignite Prolif gem. And if you then get Awakened Burning, it is such a large damage increase. It's one of the best things you can do. And you can see here, we do have Empower as an option in the build. It is very, very not worth it in my opinion. If we look at the difference between a level 3 elemental damage with attacks, you can see here that this is 1.4 million damage and this is 1.3. So a level 3 is not worth it in this scenario. And a level 4 is worth it, but only by like an additional 12%. So since Empower level 4 can be so expensive, this is generally something that is the last thing you do. And obviously we do have Awaken elemental damage with attacks, which I think makes it a 3% difference, something like that. Empower is normally something only I use if I'm later able to get rid of the life tap setup. But considering the price tag of Empower, one of the last things you should consider, Awaken elemental damage with attacks and Awaken burning damage ends up being very cheap options to get really high damage. Another thing that's recently changed, which we had different ways of dealing with last patch, was that the Ignite chance was removed from the quality of Explosive Arrow. And how are we now getting our Ignite chance? So if we look at calculations here, we do have a few different ways that we can get this, and we are still getting 100%. Now, we are getting 25 from Combustion, we have some base chance to hit, and we have different ways. We can get a Helmet Implicit, that is Eater of Worlds, and that is 10% chance to ignite. We can, in the end game, get a Redeemer Helmet, that has 15% chance to ignite. However, even if you don't have any of these options, you are at a 90% chance to ignite, and you are using Arcanist Brand with a flammability for bosses. So for bosses, you basically have a 110 chance to ignite, making this not an issue. And the 90% is more than enough for mapping. Early on this build, we are hit-based. And basically, when we're swapping over from hit-based to DAW, is once you're able to start picking up Holy Fire, you go from Precise Technique to Elemental Overload. Make sure you never have these at the same time. We have Holy Dominion. We have the nodes here, but before that switch to full ignite, you can see here that we have increases and reductions to projectile speed, also apply to damage with bows, and as some of you might have surmised, Quill Rain has up to 100% projectile speed. This does not affect our dot, but it does affect our hit early on, so this is really, really nice. For those that don't know how Precise Technique works, I'll show you in-game, and it's very important. Some people will look at the default attack here when they're looking at this. However, you need to click Explosive Arrow. This is also important for your chance to ignite, because your default attack will not be affected by Combustion. It's not linked to default attack. So you'll see something like this, 90% chance depending on where you are in progression. Again, we are getting the last 20% from Flammability. And then if I wanted precise technique to work, we would need that number to be higher than my life. Now, this starts being difficult somewhere between level 40 to 60, and that is why we switch from precise technique to elemental overload. But what about accuracy? Don't we still want a decent amount of accuracy? Once we have our Uber Lab, we have this. Enemies taunted by your attacks cannot evade, basically giving you 100% accuracy. So even if in the late game it says something like 40 to 60% here, and maybe your POB looks really, really low on damage, but you need to make sure this is clicked. The enemy is taunted. This is very important and will be a very large difference for your damage. Another thing that is important to know about Explosive Arrow is elemental equilibrium. So if we see here, the way it works is you want to have cold or lightning damage on one of your items, and more importantly, you do not want to have fire damage anywhere. No fizz as extra fire, etc. So if you see on my gloves is my only source of any flat damage to attacks. You can actually have fire percentage damage, but flat fire to attacks, etc. Very important that you don't have that. So this 13 to 23 cold damage, if I hover over here, you can see the two lines at the top. I have some cold damage, I have some lightning damage. Both of these are okay. You can have one of them, you can have either. But if at the top here it said fire damage, we are basically missing out on 25% more damage. Because basically you're always going to hit with the attack before the explosion goes off. After the explosion goes off, technically there's a tiny second where you do less damage because fire damage just occurred, but you're always hitting it right after again with new cold and lightning damage, always keeping this buff up for us. Now, what if you're playing, you've made some changes to your gear, and suddenly you are dealing very, very little damage, noticeably less damage than before, and you are not sure what's happening. You are literally, what's happening? Why are they, what's happening? Well, you have probably equipped Pierce anywhere, and if you have Pierce, what that does is the explosion needs to stick in the target and then explode. This build cannot have any Pierce at all. There's one more issue you could do with this build, and sometimes you'll be noticing that they're firing in a weird pattern, and if you're doing this against a single target, you'll be doing no damage. So what's happening here? Well, we have gotten bow attacks fire one additional projectile, and what happens then, and you can see here now, is, and it honestly won't be that bad for clearing, but you will do no damage to bosses. And what's happening is that they're firing in a V, and this will basically miss single targets entirely. So it might not be super noticeable for clearing, but I've had a lot of people reach out and be like, hey, sis, I'm dealing no boss damage, and then I'll see that they actually have +1 projectile somewhere, which actually breaks the build. So those are two of the biggest mistakes you could possibly do on Explosive Arrow. So an important thing here is you need to have either 1, 3, or 5 projectiles. All of those are okay. You just want an odd number. If you have an even number, it'll start firing in a V shape. So, Zizaran, why are we not running Deadly Ailments? It's one of the highest damage supports. Or is it? It is really, really good, especially for bosses, but there are some really big downsides to Deadly Ailments. And you'll see that it changes our actual hit very, very low. So right now our average damage is 900,000 per actual explosion. That goes down to 179,000. Now a huge downside of this is anytime you encounter those monsters that are ignite immune, etc., that will you will really, really notice it. And more importantly, the running the map mod of Avoid Ailments is actually very doable when you don't run Daily Ailments. I have no big problem with that because the explosion does so much damage. However, if you have Deadly Ailments in, you will hate yourself in these maps. So it is something to consider that you can run Deadly Ailments, and it is a green gem. Other map mods you want to avoid. No regen is really annoying on this build. The number one map mod you want to avoid is enemies cannot be taunted. That will make that you have 50-60% accuracy, you lose a lot of your defense, etc. Definitely avoid that mod. Another really good amulet for this build is Replica Dragonfang. However, they can be quite rare and very expensive, and often crafting a rare amulet is more than enough. So, bows have changed quite a lot. In last league, you could actually use a thicket bow because it was so easy to get white sockets. So getting an item level 86 thicket bow gives us that up to 100% elemental damage with attacks. The second highest elemental damage with attacks is at item level 81, and it is possible to get short bows So make sure you have item level 81 plus shortbows on your filter. 86 will be incredibly rare. Your best case of getting one is going to be a blight ravaged map. Grove bows are quite doable to get. However, getting perfect colors in this can be still over 2,000 crumbs. So a big pain. Omens can help with this, but remember that this will recolor the item and then give 3 whites. So they're also a bit of a pain. You really do want a short bow. But we are in luck because short bows are very, very farmable from the Porcupine set, and Cemetery and Gardens is next to each other. And there's a really cool strategy we can do here. Here is a map of the Atlas for the upcoming Necropolis League. This is going to be a little bit more in-depth strategy, but it's super worth mentioning, especially for this build. And this is something where you could effectively brick your Atlas, so I do want to explain it early, and this would also help you in other builds. So in Gardens, we have a div card called the Porcupine. It can be a bit of a pain to farm. It can take upwards of like 10 hours of farming, but how do we get a lot of Gardens maps? So if we have a tier 5 Gardens as the only tier 5 map we clear, we don't do any of the others. Technically, you could do Courtyard, but in this strategy, we're not going to do that. So we have tier 5 Gardens as the only tier 5 that we clear. I'm also going to do Cemetery as the only tier 4 I clear. And now what's going to happen is, first off, we're going to bounce very neatly between those two quite often. However, if I'm doing a tier 7, 8, 9, etc., in any of these maps, if a tier 5 drops, it is always going to be a Gardens. It is always going to be a Cemetery. So when you are getting like your yellow points and maybe even later red points, if you're going up early, you will notice a large amount of these maps. So I normally clear this as my tier 5, clear this as my tier 4, and you can use Horizon Orbs to do this. Then I start completing my yellow maps here, and by the time I've gotten a bunch of Atlas skill points, I will also have a large amount of tier 5 Gardens, because every tier 5 that drops will be a Gardens map. Now, there's no way to uncomplete maps on the Atlas, so if you accidentally complete another tier 5, you're fucked. Now, I'm going to quickly teach you how that we create our basic bow. It's so important for this build, and it's so nice that we get such a free 6th link. On an item level 50 bow, you can't use anything else than dreads. You need dreads to force the item level, because if you were rolling this naturally, you could only hit +1. However, with a shrieking dread, it will force tier 2, and this is super strong, because even though it's item level 50 bow, we can now make it +3. So what I'd be looking for now is I'm looking for attack speed. Can be tempting to take high like damage over time multiplier, but we're normally looking for attack speed and open affixes. So let's look at this bow. We have an open suffix, we have no open prefix, which we do need. In this case, I can use a Orb of Annulment. I didn't hit what I wanted to hit. We hit another Orb of Annulment, we remove the cold damage, and hopefully we don't remove the bow or attack speed, or I would have to start over. Now, what we do next is we do cannot roll attack mods. Boom. And now we just use an Exalted Orb. We hit a dead suffix. This doesn't matter. We just needed to fill up. Obviously, it would be great if it hit something crazy. But now the next Exalted Orb is going to guarantee +1 level of Socketed Gems. So whenever an Exalted Orb hits a prefix while you have cannot roll attack mods, you're guaranteed +3. Now on the last one, we simply craft the Minion attack speed, which we've already explained why it gives you attack speed earlier in the segment. But now we have a perfect bow for early game, and then we can start saving up for ideally a level 86 short bow, or maybe a grove bow, and then spend an eternity recoloring it, or just go for item level 81, and that will be quite obtainable, and then we can create a more advanced bow later on. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Sub if you liked the video, but more importantly, try to die less than I do, and good luck for Necropolis League.